Thank you again to Ben and to Alex. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sophie Robinson-Tillett. I'm a sustainable finance journalist, founder of Real Economy Progress, contributing editor at IPE, Investments in Pensions Europe, and a senior associate here at the Public and Third Sector Academy for Sustainable Finance. And I'm very, very, very pleased to be chairing this opening session for the second year in a row. And what a year it's been. There's not going to be a shortage of things to talk about in this conference. To help us take stock of it all, I'm joined by a wonderful panel. And Simpson at the far end, Global Head of Sustainability at Franklin Templeton. She's our investor on this panel. Nathan Fabian at this end, Chief Sustainable Systems Officer at the Principles of Responsible Investment. Richard Barker, a member of the International Sustainability Standards Board. Bob Eccles, Visiting Professor of Management here at the Oxford University. And Yulanda Chung, Head of Sustainability at DBS Bank. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Many of you in this room, and certainly many of the people up here, will have been part of a wave of debate and discussion 5 or 6 years ago about what sustainable finance would need to look like if it was going to go mainstream. And that process kind of ushered in a new theory of change for sustainable finance, one that usurped the kind of old school way of thinking around sustainable finance, which was much more about the credibility of your asset allocation, put your money where your mouth is, pushing for regulation that penalised companies that behaved badly, and with a view to ethics and values being incorporated into the conversation. And what came out of that, and of course there was no formal agreement about what the theory of change was, but by and large, what came out had a few sort of pillars to it. Firstly, that sustainable finance should have nothing to do with ethics. It's not sort of tree-hugging, it's serious financial decision-making. That it has everything to do with disclosure, that if you give investors and financial institutions the right information, that they will make the right decisions. That it needs to be internationalized, that global investors need global standards and expectations to deal with global problems. That none of it will be effective without the mobilization of financial institutions around the world, collaboration on expectations, goals, timeframes, and that kind of thing. Stewardship is way more effective than asset allocation when it comes to creating change in the market, especially if it's done collaboratively. I know people are shaking their heads. This is not my opinion. It's just generally, I think, the basis of the thinking over the last few years, that the priority for that stewardship should be on fossil fuels and the supply side, and on traditional public equities, voting and engagement. Certainly not the only focus of stewardship, but a big priority, I think. And finally, it should be about carrots and not about sticks. So there is a real move away from a push to penalise towards regulation and stuff that looks at incentivizing change. We've seen that a lot in the regulation out of North America and Europe recently. Now, we'd be here all day if I listed all of the ways that over the last 12 months since we sat up on this panel last year, those theories have been tested, attacked, undermined, challenged. Backlash in the US supposedly against collaboration, scattering of net zero investors from the collaborative bodies that were only set up a couple of years ago, oil majors making more or less no progress on decarbonisation, and in some cases just ripping up their climate commitments because they realised they wouldn't make them as much money over the short term. Slew of investors divesting from fossil fuels particularly, but elsewhere because they didn't feel they can justify engagement any longer. And a lot of chaos and cost and confusion around a lot of new reporting rules. So the truths that won out 5 or 6 years ago have been tested to breaking point over the last 12 months. Certainly in Europe and the US, but we can talk about what it looks like more globally for sure. So in this session, we're going to explore which of them survived, which of them need rethinking, what might replace them, if anything, and whether over the next 12 months, 18 months as we look forward, we might see a new theory of change begin to crystallise, a sustainable finance 3.0. So we're keeping it nice and light for a Wednesday morning. Nathan, I want to start with you if I can. You've been part of this conversation for a very long time, and for those of you who don't know, Nathan also chaired the body that advised the EU on many of its sustainable finance interventions in the last few years, a role which he stepped down from in January. So you've seen it from all angles. Do you want to kick us off with what sustainable finance looks like in July 2023?
Thanks, Sophie. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. See if we can get to a 3.0 rather than a 2.1 version. So an interesting thing about theory of change, I'm sure many of you know, but you usually start with some desired social or systemic objective, and then you work back from there. And so there's many potential things that one could do. Really the question is, to what end? And we must be clear on that, I think. If the desired end was to make markets informed on ESG and sustainability issues, I'd say it's gone pretty well. If the desired end was a sustainable economy with sustainable returns, another way to say that might be an economy operating within planetary boundaries and operating equitably and basically promoting, not undermining human rights, then probably you wouldn't say it hasn't gone so well. I think everyone knows the maths on the environmental science. And the evidence, although we've lifted a lot of people out of poverty, we couldn't really say that we've made our societies more equitable. So you need to make a choice, and hopefully my colleagues will draw out different starting points or different desired changes, especially as we try and think about the way this is being played out in North America versus Europe. So that's the first thing. So if I revert back to the PRI mission of 2006, let's call that the 0.1 version of responsible investment, even that contemplated benefits to the environment and society as a whole from responsible investment. So even back then, we had some idea that there had to be something more than making me a better risk-adjusted returns investor. And I think that's a valid idea that is only gaining in importance and probably drove this idea of needing a 2.0 in the first place. So I think it's reasonable to say there's a huge delivery gap on the idea of what responsible investment and sustainable markets should deliver, and therefore we do actually have a problem because we're not aligned with sustainability outcomes. The truth is we don't have enough financial activity aligned with sustainability outcomes, and while this sector is not solely responsible, we need to quite closely evaluate our assumptions and what benefits we think we're contributing to that end. So, we may once have thought that the key lever to a more sustainable economy was altering the cost and availability of capital. I'm not sure that's the right lever, the right levers, and there's some very good reasons. Even though we are getting a greenium in green bonds of a marginal proportion, the idea that sustainable investing is consistently cheaper or provides lower returns to investors through a substantial economic restructure actually has some problems for the investors. So we've got to really think carefully about the cost of capital side. And on the availability side, well, we have a world that's still fairly flush with liquidity, and we have countries moving at different paces. So it's always possible to find some other investors somewhere. And so we've also got a problem on the availability side. So we just need to interrogate that idea of cost and availability of capital being the key levers, I'd say. If I could give an alternative, which we should consider, and that is that capital redeployment and effectiveness of the enabling environment on sustainability are, however, levers that we do have some attributable contribution to make as a finance community. So capital redeployment and effectiveness of the enabling environment. And by the latter, I mean things like the setting or the adoption of sustainability targets by governments, sectoral transition policy, subsidies and taxes, financial regulation and reporting standards. We all know, we've learned in the last few years which parts of the system we think we need to adjust, and we have a meaningful role to play in doing that. Okay, so I'll try and move a little quicker and wrap up. So the main levers, some version of allocate capital, steward capital, and engage in financial system function. They're our main levers. And there are specific ways to do that. Data and the use of data all the way from investees through to ultimate beneficiaries of the financial system. That data chain is critical. We're going to talk about that in a moment, I know. The idea of stewardship, what's it for if you are thinking about sustainable outcomes? And how good is good enough on stewardship if a sustainable economy is actually the target? That's the change you're trying to seek. And I say that a lot of our stewardship activity is not contemplated with that outcome in mind, and we need to reevaluate that. When it comes to engaging in policy, the truth is we are losing. There's a lot of progress in a lot of countries, but in many markets we're moving way too slowly, and in some countries the trend is against substantial reform. Okay, so we're not where we need to be on policy engagement, and we're still being massively outspent by economic interests that would like to slow this down, and we have to reevaluate that. So, it's not all doom and gloom. One reading of this might say, actually, the theory of change is basically working, it's just going too slow. And I think we have to question, if it is going too slow, and we end up with 2.5 or 3 degrees of warming, we end up with massive biodiversity problems, and we end up with quite significant social dislocation, have we failed? And we probably have to look pretty hard at that question, I'd say. So too slow is not a win, really. So what could we do? And this is my thought, and others will have different views. But I think we need to be much clearer on the roles and limits of the different actors in the financial system. We should not expect large individual client-serving investment managers to have the same level of accountability to the future that an institution managing pensions or insurance or sovereign funds will do. And we need to look through the idea that everyone in the financial system is equally accountable and has therefore the same expected activities. Because we're never going to get through greenwashing and green hushing unless we can distinguish these ideas and better identify the roles, and then better identify the weaknesses, what's not working well in the different roles. So I'll go a little further. If I am one of these long liability institutions, I've got no problem saying that is fundamentally a social purpose, and the duties of loyalty and prudence to the beneficiaries of pensions, insurance and sovereigns largely are to provide that financial function in a sustainable economy. Because extracting value from a future economy for today's savings balance is not loyally serving your beneficiary. So we have some realignment to do there. But we have to accept that the risk managers are going to be the risk managers. Their job is to be informed, it's to be diligent, it's to serve well, it's to use the data that we're now starting to provide them and to deal with all the inconsistencies in the ways they manage their business about how they're betting on and supporting transitioning economies. And so the roles are different, and we shouldn't expect the manager to set goals that are 2040 aligned with the same level of commitment that we would from a pension fund who has 40 or 50-year obligations. So we need to distill that and think much more clearly. Now, when we are goal-aligned, we do things differently. Systemic stewardship is far more forensic and goes through to a conclusion. If companies don't have suitable transition plans that satisfy us, then we do have to adjust boards. We do have to underweight. We do have to look for alternatives. We have to use targets to guide our investment strategy, but not blindly divest from sectors through volatile economic change, which we have and we're going to continue to have. So blindly following targets does not help us sufficiently. They're signals and we can use them to help inform how we engage and who we speak to and what we ask for, but we need some wiggle room, as everyone's now going to find out on net zero by 2050. And of course, we need to broaden our idea of what systemic stewardship looks like. So we need companies to change, we need policy change, we need standards change, we need all of the supporting and reinforcing actors in the financial system to also be on board and forensically check and change how they are supporting those longer dated anchors of the financial system, the ultimate caretakers of savings, how they're acting and conducting their activities. Now, if we can't make that work, if we can't make a cornerstone of the financial system that has a long-term obligation to influence financial market function, then our theory of change really has serious limits, I'd say. Now, there might be alternative theories of change, but that's the way we're thinking about it at the moment at the PRI. Thank you.
Wow. Lots to think about, lots to pull out for the other panelists as well. Thank you very much, Nathan. Yulanda, can I come to you? Do you have thoughts on what Nathan's just said, thoughts on what I've said, and a bit more about your perspective sitting in Asia and sitting in a kind of bank perspective rather than in a
certainly. So I am based now in Singapore, working for a Singaporean bank called DBS. Much of our business is done in Southeast Asia.
Can everyone hear? No, I can see a few of these going on. Can we make sure that Yulanda can be heard?
Testing?
Yeah, that sounds better.
So I'm based in Singapore representing DBS, which is a bank with much of our business in Southeast Asia. And our core business activity is lending, a bit less on capital markets activities, and even less on asset management, and as a result, not working very closely with Nathan's PRI as a result. I think what Nathan has just described, the theory of change, there is a lot I agree with, and there are a couple of points that I think, coming from an Asian bank, we have a different perspective. I definitely agree that the theory of change for many years has focused on targeting financial institutions to redirect capital to things that are considered sustainable. So for a long time, I remember 5-6 years ago when I participated in one of those donors brainstorming sessions at MIT, and there was people from the Bloomberg Foundation, the Rockefellers, Jeremy Grantham himself, all talking about their theory of change. And at that time, the focus was we need to stop financial institutions underwriting thermal coal activities, whether it is mining or power generation. That is really the theory of change at that time. And I feel that this is the point that I agree with Nathan. It has worked, but it has worked very, very slowly. For decades, European banks started the momentum first of saying, we will now stop financing coal. Then it became that the Japanese, Korean, Asian banks took up the slack, and that lasted for another decade. And then the momentum has come to Asia. Even the Asian banks and Chinese banks are now saying, yeah, we're not going to do stranded assets thermal coal financing. So it took some 3 decades for this momentum to reach the conclusion that the theory of change would like to reach. And that really is too slow. But I do feel there is one point that in Asia, even though we have this culture of not being too confrontational, but we do feel that the emergence of El Nino, we are now preparing Southeast Asia for the rising of haze phenomenon, the forest fires that will engulf the region. We're all worried about that. And I think the weather phenomenon that we are seeing in Europe, in North America, and also in Asia is going to galvanize a lot of more radical approaches. And we need to be more welcoming to less collegial way of working together, whether it is litigations or campaign groups, street protests. I think these are the things that even in Asia, with our cultural norms taken into account, we would have to embrace.
Really interesting points. Thank you very much. And I want to talk a little bit later about this kind of global perspective. But first I want to come to Richard, if I can. From a disclosures perspective, Richard, you've been making all the headlines lately. We're renewing some hope for some in the idea of globalizing bits of sustainable finance. Do you want to share your thoughts from that place at the table on what this theory of change should look like?
Thank you. Yes. How's the volume? Can you hear that okay? At the back? Yep.
Yeah.
All right, good. So Nathan talked about systems change and the need for different elements of the system to adjust. I couldn't agree more. And the International Sustainability Standards Board has a particular role to play within that overall systems change. I would describe it as a necessary but not sufficient condition for achieving the sustainability targets we all want to achieve. Nathan also said that markets understand ESG issues well, which I hope they don't, because our job is to help ensure that they do. But where we do agree is on the lack of progress towards achieving sustainability goals. If you look at the collective progress that's been made since Paris, and then you look at the recent warming in Americas and across Europe and so on, and the rate of emissions since Paris, and the rate of biodiversity loss and deforestation and all the rest of it, we can't claim to be making progress here, and we need to be honest about that. So ISSB was created in COP26, as you may know, in response to investor demand. So it's particularly good, welcome from my point of view, to be in an investor-focused audience here, because investors are absolutely core to the reason why we exist, and to our theory of change, and to our role within the wider system. So we were set up to do various things. One was to consolidate the reporting landscape, which I think is a universal wish, and that's very much in progress. So SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, Integrated Reporting, CDSB, no longer exist as separate entities. They are all part of the IFRS Foundation. CDP will use IFRS S2 data for its platforms. That covers half of the world's listed companies. We have issued our first two standards as of a couple of weeks ago, as you probably know, S1 on general requirements, S2 on climate. Both of those standards build very explicitly on TCFD. This was a very clear design principle from the start. It's one that's played really well across different audiences and different jurisdictions. You know, the idea of building on that base has been very well received. You may have seen in the last week or so that TCFD itself has announced its own sunsetting, and its work will be continued by the ISSB. So this is the latest step in that process. So TCFD was never set up to be a standard-setting body. It wasn't set up to be a permanent institution. It was set up as a change maker, as it were, and it's done its job in enabling that change, and moving to mandatory reporting through ISSB is the natural next step in that evolution. A further key element for us is alignment with financial reporting and the other side of our house, the IASB. So IFRS accounting standards are used in 160 countries or thereabouts worldwide, and mandatory in 140 or so. And of course, the reason why the IFRS Foundation has taken on sustainability reporting is because there is a demand for investors for sustainability-related financial disclosures that complement financial accounting. So such things as transition plans. I mean, I think the transition plans in particular, I would say, is an absolute core connection between, as it were, traditional sustainability reporting and financially oriented sustainability reporting. So a lot of progress in the right direction, and the really big challenge for us now, and in terms of how we fit into the system, is one of adoption. I think if you were to ask anybody working in this space, the idea of global standards and of alignment of data and of reporting is something of a no-brainer. You may get different answers on who should be doing the standardization, right? So there still remains some sort of political geopolitics and so on in this space. But the logic, especially in sustainability reporting, where you're reporting over a whole value chain and not just for an individual entity, the logic of reporting standardized data across the value chain in a globally consistent way is compelling and obvious. Now, for us, and how we fit into this landscape, the adoption question is absolutely critical, and there are two routes to adoption. One is voluntary and the other is mandatory. Mandatory adoption takes time, and we don't have time, I think, viewed from a bigger sustainability perspective. So if you take the same amount of time that it took international accounting standards to become embedded globally, if we wait that long, it's too late. And so what's really important, I think, in terms of direction of travel is that it's clear where we are going and that companies voluntarily adopt in the direction in which we are going. And so a shared sense of direction, I think, is critical. So you are seeing, in that regard, very encouraging steps towards mandatory adoption in places like UK, Japan, Hong Kong, Nigeria, Canada, Singapore, in various different stages. This is unsurprising, I think, this type of development. But critically, voluntary adoption, especially for entities which already do sustainability reporting and do it well, voluntarily adopting ISSB standards well will lead market practice elsewhere. So what's the role of investors in all of this and on the challenge of going too slow and what is a reasonable ask from you to help accelerate this process towards where we need to be? I've got 5 things here. The first one is to encourage voluntary adoption by companies, of all sizes in all jurisdictions. Second one is to encourage sector-focused reporting and the development of norms within sectors. So a key difference between our IFRS sustainability standards and IFRS accounting standards is that our accounting standards are thematic. You know, you have a standard for financial institutions, for financial instruments, and if you happen to have a lot of financial instruments, you're probably a bank, right? But we don't have a standard for banks. Whereas in sustainability reporting, as you well know, the challenges are very different by sector, the material issues are very different by sector, and the transition plans, the transition pathways are different by sector. And so building the reporting norms, in a sense, bottom up at a sector level and encouraging that sector reporting, I think, is super important. And is something that will be embedded in due course in our standards. So SASB standards are a part of our reporting setup. In due course, there will be mandatory ISSB sector-based standards, but we're not there yet. And so voluntary market progress in that direction is hugely important. Third thing I would encourage is for you to encourage preparers, reporters, companies to estimate, to do best effort, to report on where they are in their journey towards sustainability. A big obstacle, I think, towards effective reporting in this space is a perception that because it's IFRS reporting, it must be like accounting, and accounting requires accuracy. And accuracy means everything adds up into the bottom line, and the bottom line is super important. This domain is very different from that. We're not in the same place in terms of data availability, reporting methods and so on, to be as accurate as financial accounting is. Neither do we need to be, right? Because what matters is understanding what are the primary sustainability-related impacts, risks, and opportunities that companies have, and as a result, from an investor point of view, what are the financial effects of those? So ballpark information is actually incredibly useful, and precise information is not all that important, actually. So encouraging direction of travel and reporting where the company is at its current moment in time is really important. Fourth thing is to encourage, firstly, climate first. And I say that for 2 reasons, partly because climate is the primary issue, but also because reporting on climate is the gateway to reporting well on everything else. If you're good at reporting climate-related effects throughout your value chain, you will be good at doing sustainability reporting. If you try to report on everything from day one, you will be bad at sustainability reporting, and the effect will be to set you back. So climate first, but also to focus on the material issues in a given sector for a given investee. So sustainability reporting, which is wide disclosure, compliance disclosure, if you like, on everything, is of no help to anybody. Focusing on the material issues that the board is or ought to be focusing on from a sustainability perspective, that's what needs to be encouraged. The final thing is please respond to our request for information, our agenda consultation, which is asking what we should do next. And, what should S3 be in substance? For us, the client is the investor, right? So the reason we exist, the reason we develop standards in the way we do is to meet the information needs of investors. And so hearing from investors by, I think it's the early September, on our agenda consultation about what you would like us to do next is also a really important part of our theory of change. Thank you.
Fab, thank you very much indeed. Richard, Bob, we've heard a lot so far. You've got a kind of US, UK, you straddle both. You've been keeping a close eye on some of the backlash that's been going on in the States, and you have big views on disclosure. I'm sure you have big views on all of this. Can you tell us what they are?
So, listen, I'd be happy to. What Nathan said was fascinating. I mean, I had no idea what he was going to say. I begged you, Sophie, for a pre-panel call, and you kept saying we don't need one. We've got a crackerjack set of panelists. I'm too busy. I've got to write a lot of stuff. So this all came as a surprise to me, Nathan, and we're going to get together. We're going to talk about it next week, and I'm going to tie it to my final point, which I don't know what the theory of change is, but I've got a suggestion for a process to get there. I need to give you also a heads up, Nathan, that you may have some trademark issues in the United States on PRI. Are you aware of this? Well, you know, I'm pretty plugged into what's going on in the United States. You're all jealous that I'm engaged in the culture wars, and I don't know what you're doing with your life. I mean, you don't know what fun you're missing. Point Bridge has created the America First ETF MAGA. It's got all of $17 million in it right now. And you can invest your Republican values. And so they have trademarked principles for Republican investing. So just a little heads up, because our lawyers are better than your lawyers, so you should know about that. So let me talk about the culture wars a little bit. Every time I turn around, there's some batshit crazy thing being done by some red state attorney general proposing some kind of legislation, some kind of law. Some of the stuff is so stupid you can't believe it, right? I'm grateful because it's like material to write about. I've got my little column on Forbes.com, and so you can do these kind of snarky takedowns. Most of this legislation isn't going anywhere. I mean, some of this stuff is like out there. There's a guy that I'm basically supporting to run for president in the Republican campaign because they've got all these people that are anti-ESG. None of them have put their finger on the real problem of ESG. Bill Tveet in North Dakota, a representative to the North Dakota legislature has, and I've got this in the North Dakota Daily News, ESG is a human-organized satanic cult violating the laws of God. Okay, you think you've got problems. I mean, it's not woke. I mean, this is like a fucking satanic cult that we're sort of dealing with here. So I'm going, okay, that's sort of interesting. You've got all these red states. We're going to boycott the boycotters. Right. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. You know, you got the left beating up on them because they hold fossil fuels. They say you're boycotting fossil fuels. They're going to boycott you. Can't do that. But then, oh, by the way, we want to boycott Chinese companies, and so they're trying to use the political apparatus, and they're saying, my people are trying to use the political apparatus instead of, you know, going through Congress and stuff. I live in Massachusetts. I was a hippie many years ago, so I'm pretty left-wing. I'm more left-wing than my wife, who still managed to be happily married for 39 years. She's a proud independent. I'm like watching all this stuff going on, right? And I write a piece called Rift Capitalism, the GOP's brilliant strategy for, you know, destroying ordinary Americans. And I get an email from this lawyer friend of mine I've known for 20 years named Dan Crowley. Long story about our conversation. So he's Republican, and he says, you know, let's talk about it. So we've written a couple of pieces together. We wrote one in the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance called Turning Down the Heat in the ESG debates, separating material risk disclosures from salient political issues. And when you get below the crazy stuff, that's a lot of what it is. Right? It's like, what is the division of labor between the public sector and the private sector? We wrote something in the Harvard Business Review. With another Republican, I wrote a piece in something called Real Clear Energy about ERISA, which I won't get into the details on. If you're not American, it's not important. And with a guy named Eli Lair, he's not a Republican. It's worse. He's a libertarian. And I've written a piece with him. It's time to call a truce in the red state ESG culture wars. So I'm going along and I'm saying, well, this is interesting. I'm finding sort of the Republicans that used to exist, not the MAGA crowd. There's a lot to agree with them on. There's a lot. They're all kind of quiet, you know, because you still have the Trump effect and you've got, you know, all the red state stuff. But that's mostly happening at the state level. I have met with people in Congress, Republicans in Congress, with congressmen. I've met with their staffers. Very different conversations than the stuff that you see in the press. They're constructive, they're candid, You agree on some things, you don't agree on some things. I have written a statement which has been submitted to all of the members of the House Financial Services Committee, both the majority and the minority, as we say. And I'm going to publish that. And, you know, the early feedback is that nobody likes all of it. You know, the right likes some of it, and they hate the last section because I think scope 1 and 2 is okay, and then the left hates me because I'm not all down on scope 3. So I'm finding this whole conversation absolutely fascinating, right? Because we live in bubbles. I think this is a bubble, to be honest with you. I was in a bubble at the end of June. I'm at a Greenfin conference in Boston, my hometown. Lots of lobsters, cheap this time of year. I'm doing the opening plenary with a guy named Leo Strine, former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court. There's 900 people in the audience. I said, just to kind of get a sense of the group, how many people in here are Republican? 2 people. 2 people out of 900, okay? I said, come on, you know, 2 people. How many people know a Republican? 20. Leo goes, how many are independents? Maybe there's 25. This was Greenfin, not Greenpeace, okay? And it's 2 out of 900. One of them came up afterwards to introduce himself to me, brave man. We took a selfie. I'm collecting a gallery of me with Republicans. It's very nice. I'm going to put it in my library. Bob and his Republican friends. I'm making all these Republican friends. And my Democratic friends go, but that's nice. It's like, somebody needs to talk to these people, and I'm glad it's you, and it's not me. And I say, well, that's actually, you know, kind of interesting, and I'm finding that I agree with them on some things. What do you agree with them on? I'm like, okay, so everybody's got an orthodoxy, right? And some of these people are really focused on climate. And this is where it gets, I think, especially interesting and relevant and gets to the theory of change. So some of this will become more public as things go along, but I have met a CIO of a state pension fund who's libertarian. So he's in a red state. I go, oh, you're Republican, right? He goes, oh, no, man, you know, like I'm libertarian, and they all look down on me and say, well, that's okay. So the Republicans hate you too. So he goes, liberals have a better sense of urgency around climate change. They got all the wrong policies, okay? And he's got a very clear view. He may be right, he may be wrong, but he's got a clear view. There's a woman I know in a major, major bank who's a lefty like me. The amount of agreement that she has with this libertarian CIO is a lot, okay? Now, it's kind of hard for her because she's at a bank. She can't speak a personal view. You get into issues around GFANs, and this is why what I thought Nathan was saying. It's like sometimes I'm in these conferences, gee, I got a question about GFANs. It's like you're violating the orthodoxy. I still don't really get the theory of GFANs, okay? And if somebody can enlighten me on that, that's good. I get Climate Action 100. GFANs, I mean, what you have, and Nathan talked about this, is there's this thesis that the financial sector is going to kind of lead the change for the energy transition. That's the big bet that's being made. And, you know, the crazy Republicans, you know, bash on this and say it's a bunch of global elites. That's the Republican boogeyman, global elites, right? The Democratic boogeyman is dark money. Every time I turn around, I'm reading about dark money. I'm like, well, what is dark money? It's like, okay, so here's this money from this guy to this guy to this guy. So we can trace all the money, but it's dark money because we don't like the cause, so it's a dark cause. So there's a difference between dark money and light money. I guess our dark money, because the Democrats have more dark money, but because it's the right thing, it's a light money thing. So there's all this rhetoric that's confusing things. When you get down to the issues, I've learned a lot. As I said, I'm no expert on climate. Renewable energy, renewable energy, renewable energy. We need more renewable energy. You know, we need more transmission lines. But to get transmission lines, we need permitting. Well, we can't have permitting, and everybody's mad that Biden does this thing with Joe Manchin so he can have permitting. There are trade-offs, okay? And people don't want to acknowledge the trade-offs. I would say the Republican position, as best I understand it, is more free market-based than government-based in terms of developing technologies, but they would agree with Nathan. I mean, it's amazing how much similarity there is, the view that you presented with these Republicans I'm talking to, and it gets into is the financial sector trying to, you know, abrogate for itself things that should be done by the government policies, carbon taxes, or whatever. There's a group called ClearPath, an NGO that's very focused on climate. there is a conservative climate caucus. And so their sense of urgency is the same. It's easy to be cynical about it. It's easy for them to be cynical about us. But, you know, it's a shared problem. And so let me close, as I said, I don't know what, 3.0 is, but unless we all get outside of our bubble, and the Republicans get outside of their bubble, and you find people that recognize the urgency of dealing with climate change, but can have very different views as to how that should be addressed, personally, I don't think we're going to get to the 3.0 theory of change that we need.
Interesting stuff. Okay, so we've covered a lot there between our speakers so far, bursting these bubbles, stop being tribal, find the common ground, more honesty about the trade-offs, real economy and policy work, voluntary adoption of what's out there already, be less collegiate, serious escalation strategies when it comes to stewardship and asset allocation, holding the right institutions accountable for the right stuff, and the asset owners maybe have an innate mandate to deal with sustainability objectives in a way that other players might find more difficult. Anne, you are our only investor. Tell us.
First of all, I have to put the record straight with Cheeky Bob, my friend and comrade at arms, because my friend Sophie was just traduced. Should we have a planning call? Says Sophie by email. Nah, says Bob. I know what I want to say. So, now we begin.
Oh, I've been outed.
Just saying, steady on. Know who your friends are. Okay, theory of change. I first of all applaud Oxford, this event, Ben's tremendous work, Sophie, bringing the big question for us all to start with, because we're not fooling around at this stage, are we? So I was thinking about this theory of change, which always sounds a little bit like, David Hume's philosophy of billiard balls. Clock this, that will go, ping it in the right direction, something pops into the pocket. But this is so complex, and some of it's so uncertain. And as Yogi Berra, the wonderful American baseball quip that he gave us, the future is uncertain because it hasn't happened yet. But what's different for us is we are in a new era of our own making. And I thought, as I was preparing for this, and we were all talking about the long view, it's not very long until 2050. Just saying. It's less than 30 years. I'll be 102, and I invite you all to my birthday party. So we'll be celebrating, I'm sure, that we've got this done. But we then have to say, how do we get to this point where, around 1950, geologists look back and say, we are in a new era, the Anthropocene era, which means everything that matters to support human life is being impacted by what humans are getting up to. Atmosphere, biology, even geology from radiation that we've released through bombs mostly, and testing, the hydrology of the planet, and so on and so forth. So if we start thinking about the long term in a different way, and we look back and say, so we've got 30 years to sort things out, to get from world energy dependence at the level of 80% right now, to net zero in 30 years, or a bit less. Okay, hold that thought. That is not long-term, that's pretty well immediate. So that sense of urgency must be upon us. Then we look back and say, well, how quickly did we manage to get ourselves to starting a whole new era in geology called the Anthropocene? Well, people disagree, and I'm not a geologist or a paleontologist or an oleogeologist of any sort. You look to the first industrial revolution, people starting to use coal, 300 years ago. So add a couple of zeros to your 30 years to get it sorted out. So only 300 years ago were humans stumbling upon this fabulous store of energy. Where did that come from? That's fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. Now, here's a bit of a marketing line that I'm surprised the oil industry hasn't landed on, for T-shirts and things. Oil, formerly known as trees. Where did coal come from? Well, think of those zeros, think of the number 3, 300 million years ago, we had this wonderful thing. It's not going to show up in your Jurassic Park movie, but the Carboniferous era was there for tens of millions of years. What did that do? Well, the Earth was covered with trees, marvelous, and all sorts of other little flora and fauna, and it's called Carboniferous from the Latin. We get Carboniferous carbon, and fur is to bear a load or to carry. It's the era that carried the carbon. However, we are benefiting from another interesting accident in the timing of the evolution, because the microbes that were hanging around then hadn't evolved enough to be able to decompose carbon. So all those lovely trees and crustaceans and other plants and animals, another discussion about why it came to an end. That's for the astrophysicists among us. That all came compressed by rock into the fossil fuels we're worrying about how to kick our addiction to, or our dependence upon, I should say more properly. Those microbes didn't develop the capacity for decomposing that type of material for another 60 million years. So we've got this neatly stored pile of carbon 300 million years ago. 300 years ago, we start working out how to use it. And over that immensely short period of time, we've got to an Anthropocene era. I mean, there's more to it than carbon, as we know. But think about that arc of history. So, theory of change in these circumstances where science has clearly mapped out the planetary boundaries. My colleague David Sheasby was just talking about the recent update from the Stockholm Centre. We've breached 5 of the 9. So the biosphere of the Earth, we're now at a sort of breaking point. So it's not a matter of could we, should we, or even for finance, might we, may we? It's must. We're into that. So, you know, Malvolio with his cross gaiters. Some are born great, like you, Bob. Some achieve greatness, like Sophie. Others have greatness thrust upon them. And I would say the financial system is in that Malvolio moment. Our responsibility at this stage is, as Sophie said and others have said, is so important. It's going to be to deploy capital, but it's also going to be to steward, to be the effective stewards of the capital, not just at the company level, but mindful of the systemic risk that Ellen Quigley is leading such tremendous work on for all of us. To understand that you cannot navigate your way through this situation unless you pay attention both to the big and to the immediate and what's in front of you, the micro and the macro. So the theory of change I have was beautifully on the list for the Oscars at Hollywood. This is everything, everywhere, all at once. And if anyone tells you it's more simple than that, they are deluded. But you'll tell them in a nice way, won't you, Bob?
Very nice.
Yeah, very good. So I just want to finish with the thought about what a strategy, which is everything, everywhere, all at once, would look like. So the everything means we've got to have this plan of partnership. So we know the power of markets. You know, this is, so back to Willie Sutton. You all know this lovely story from a very successful bank robber, and the law caught up with him. And the story goes, in court he's asked, why did you rob banks? It's not my American accent, but, you know.
Good try.
Thanks. It's rare to get a compliment from Bob. I'm quite pleased with that.
We're friends.
On condition.
A little bit.
Anyway, Willie Sutton, bank robber. Why do you rob banks? And Willie Sutton says, because that's where the money is. Right? Why are we, as investors, at the center of these discussions? Because that's where the money is. $300 trillion in the global system. But here's the good news. It's not our money. It's other people's money. It is the ordinary working people's money of the world. It is our common wealth. And remember, the word wealth derives from the Old English weal, W-E-A-L, which is well-being. So the common wealth that we have, we're really talking about how to deploy this for the common good. So reasons to be cheerful on that. Number one, the Sustainable Development Goals. Imagine that in 2015, and I was there at the United Nations, I had a little 4-minute slot to speak in support of the Sustainable Development Goals as an investor, and to say these are a moral imperative, yes, we all get that, and an economic necessity. Why? Because for the dear folks saving into their pension funds, they need the risk-adjusted returns that will keep them with food on the table and paying the rent and taking care of themselves in retirement. At CalPERS, we used to have this thing we called the CalPERS pension buck. For every $1, 60 cents came from investment returns. So the people's money is in the system. We're not talking about trying to sweet talk a small number of billionaires to do the right thing. We're actually talking about a very important shift in the community of interest in finance. So that's number one. That means our model for sustainability has got to put finance, got to put money at the center. And the money's got to pay the rent. It's called return on capital. But it's because we're paying the rent for people literally through their pensions. And that's the biggest source of money in the system. So this means for us, in my new job at Franklin, where, of course, good old Benjamin Franklin said, do well by doing good. And that's what really we're being tested on at the moment, all of us. If we're going to take that financial capital and deploy it, both for the risk and for the return, then we've got to recognize money on its own produces nothing. Maybe at the casino, maybe if you're playing around with Bitcoin, but money on money is not, this is old-fashioned economics. It's nothing clever. Financial capital needs to be invested alongside the stewardship of human capital. This is the workers, the supply lines, the communities, and we're now, even at the SEC, having these conversations about what the reporting needs to be, and as well as the tremendous work of the International Sustainability Standards Board. What is it about human capital that we're relying on, and what do we need to know? And then, of course, the big theme on climate change, natural capital, the understanding that the economy lives within a biosphere. I mean, it's pretty simple. You've all seen the pictures from space transmitted. Here we are on this little blue planet. That's where we live, our common home, as Pope Francis would put it. So I want to finish with a quote from Hannibal. Now, you're talking about mad. I'm not going to repeat the actual words, but you said there's some pretty crazy, what did you say? Something.
Crazy. Yeah.
We'll stick with the back.
Americans can talk like that.
I'm not American.
You know, and I didn't go to Oxford like you did and Richard did, so I get to say
That isn't where.
Oxford grads.
Yeah, but at Oxford I did learn to swear. I'm just saying it's good Anglo-Saxon stuff, so hold that thought. So the question here, here's old Hannibal, up to no good, to be honest. This is warfare. He's got herds of elephants in North Africa. He's got the bright idea to take them up the Appian Way, over the Alps, and famously, or infamously, his generals tell him, you are...
Batshit crazy.
Apparently, his reply to Bob's loose translation of the Latin,
Go fuck yourself.
I think you've done it. Not technically possible, but thank you.
Yeah.
What the generals saw, something that Hannibal viewed as urgent, necessary, they were saying cannot be done. And the reply was, and Hannibal quoted from Hercules. You may not believe in these Roman gods, but Seneca said, this is what Hercules had to say when faced with an impossible task. Inveniam viam aut faciem, which means I will find a way or make one. And sure enough, Hannibal took his elephants over the Alps. So I think at this point, it is not a matter of could we, should we, may we, would we. We don't have a choice. And getting very practical about everything, everywhere, all at once, means at the heart of our thinking on strategy, we've got to maintain our understanding of the power of markets. That's the invisible hand. There's my hand becoming invisible. The invisible hand, powerful beyond all imagining. And this has brought tremendous prosperity to many, not enough. That's the fossil fuel story of the first, second, and now the third revolution in industrial processes. But we have the visible hand of government, which represents the people in whatever way they are managing to do that or get into power. So it's a governance issue. You have the invisible hand of markets. You have the visible hand of government. And clasping those together is our strategy. Now, what this means is we've got to understand that finance on its own, although it has greatness thrust upon it, has to be in partnership. We have to be in a dialogue about all of this work. So I want to just say at the end, we're in this new era, but I don't think we can afford the luxury of despair, because it is urgent. Drawing on 300 million-year-old stores of energy, we've only done it for a pretty short while in our own 2 million or so years of history. We're at an inflection point where we've got the understanding from science, we've got the innovation and technology, we have the money that we need, and we have the policy ambition in the Sustainable Development Goals, where the Paris Agreement is nested as number 13. So I think we need to understand the barriers, and the way the Franklin Templeton phrase is, sustainability is one of the deep waves transforming the financial markets. And that means we have to navigate. And it's treacherous, there are squalls, we're a bit lost, we may have a sextant at best for navigating by the stars, but we have precious freight on board, we know what our destination is. And I'll finish with this, because it's always lovely to pay homage to Sir Adrian Cadbury. He and I, many years ago, were talking about this, and he reminded me that governance, because this is a governance challenge, getting this done, has its root in Latin, again, gubernare, which is to steer, which is to navigate. So let's be clear that we will have to tack into headwinds. That's what sailors do, as my colleague Piers Hugh-Smith knows. He's a professional competitive sailor before he became into finance, and I can see why. They're very similar ways of thinking about teamwork, about urgency, about managing danger, about the opportunity of getting to a new destination. So with that, I'm looking forward to this 3 days, because it's going to give us a chance to revisit being a crew. And yes, we do need all sides on this, Bob. With that, you're a very good reminder. But thank you, and I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thank you. And I mean, anyone who's just listened to that gets a free lesson in Latin at Oxford University, as well as thoughts on sustainable finance. There's tons there. The key takeaway at the moment seems to be that there's a greater sense of urgency, but I do think that we've probably heard that every year for the last eternity. But the theory of change is not fundamentally flawed. It's just not happening fast enough. Perhaps I can ask something quite key for many people in this space who are thinking about what happens next. Is a return to a more concrete question around whether it's viable for financial institutions to set shared goals with each other. So this is something which is a really tricky question. It's something that's plagued the space for the last year and a half, but I do think it's one that's worth hearing from our experts on. We know that most of what's happening in terms of the US backlash against collaboration is not really a legal argument. It's a political one, but nonetheless it's happening and it is taking effect. I think, Bob, you said most of the legislation you're seeing in the US isn't going anywhere, but the truth is it is having a pretty strong chilling effect on some of the institutions that we need up there front and centre, and we've seen massive departures from some of the GFAN's bodies. Whether that's important or not in terms of theory of change, I don't know, but it is happening. One of the questions that has arisen out of those developments is one of whether we've kind of gone too far on the collaboration side. Collaboration central, and set up Climate Action 100+ with other people, which works on collaborative stewardship. But in terms of collaborating, are we over-collaborating? Are we gonna, is it doing more harm than good? Does it matter if we don't have GFANs anymore? GFANs didn't exist a couple of years ago, and suddenly it's on the scene, and lots of people think it's the most important thing that ever happened in sustainable finance, and we now need to keep it alive at all costs. But there are other people that say it's actually fine, and I've spoken to people at institutions that have departed who've said, oh good, we can get on with the job now, and we don't have to worry about all of the bureaucracy around these big collaborative initiatives. I'm sure that nobody's going to be that forward in coming out on this, but does anyone have any thoughts on whether we've overcorrected or whether we've gone too far in collaboration and whether we need to come back in?
Oh, my Lord, sorry, because I've just spoken and far too long. I just have to jump in here. When we started Climate Action 100+, and we now have 700 investors with close to 80 trillion signed up for this, 3 simple goals: governance, targets, and reporting fully, disclosure. And we identified what we called the systemically important carbon emitters in parallel with, think about systemically important financial institutions. So it's only 100+ companies. However, in the short time, 4 years since we kind of got cracking, from those companies, we have commitments to net zero, which represent 25% of global emissions. That's the same as China. Now, what people will see is when we stumble, when we fail, when it's difficult, when companies change their mind, or we do big things like changing the board of Exxon, that's what investors did, where does that show up in improvement? And I know there's going to be a whole debate on that. But the point is, we've only just begun, and therefore I'm going to quote Gandhi. He was asked, what did he think about Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be a very good idea. And that's where we are with sustainable finance. We're at the beginning. So let's not, we've got to step it up and pep it up and get it moving. Part of the questions or the backlash is because of the effectiveness of what we're doing. Yeah. So just be aware, focus on the navigation, tack into that headwind.
Okay, thank you. Nathan, Nathan was taking a deep breath as if he was going to say something then.
Yeah. So, no, we need more collaboration is the short answer. It's essential. It's the best lever. If you're not participating in some collaborative initiative, get into one. It's absolutely the best thing to do. The problem that Bob identifies is right. We didn't say what we meant when GFAN started, and too often we don't say what we mean. The idea that a manager who, with a corporate ownership, who serves millions of different individual clients, can set its own 2050 target and faithfully implement that, supposedly on somebody's behalf, was frankly never going to work. But that doesn't mean that managers are not absolutely essential to the transition. So why shouldn't a GFAN's manager have a job of assessing and transparently disclosing all of the investment aligned with the goals, all of the investment that's holding back the goals, and then engage their signatory base and make sure they're transparently disclosing both the net contribution and the net harm? Why don't we have that kind of approach from a manager in GFANs? Does that mean we throw away GFANs? No, it doesn't. But it's clearly going to have a very careful repositioning and clarification of what people were meant to do there. So, and frankly, it's probably too big for meaningful collaboration, but that's a side point. Groups of sort of 50 to 200 seem to be working quite well.
Yulanda.
Well, as the only financial institution part of Net Zero Banking Alliance and the GFANs, I do feel that when Mark Carney said trillions of dollars are now directed towards sustainable development, that claim probably would be seen as greenwashing.
Yeah.
However, no, this is actually a plug for GFANS.
Yeah.
I do feel that there is value for the effort of the network coming together to have net zero goals, even though it is all the way to 2050. Because we do want to set interim targets around 2030 that is close enough to make people stay on their toes. And I know from first-hand experience that corporate banks these days do rankle over who they bank more, who they bank less, because every year we're going to report where my portfolio sits against the benchmark, which is maybe an IEA net zero glide path or others. So that transparency, and hopefully with more consistency using ISSB standards, means that investors will be able to compare us a lot better. So I think GFANS set up the stage, and investors will be able to make use of the reporting standards and the transparency that comes with it to really put financial institutions under scrutiny.
Richard?
Yeah, just a couple of points on collaboration. So collaboration, yes, absolutely essential. What we have is a problem of collective action. And I think, as we all understand, the reason the tragedy of the commons is a tragedy is because it's individually rational for people to lead to a collectively disastrous outcome. Yeah. So if you don't collaborate, then we're all in trouble. So collaboration is very clear. However, I'm deeply skeptical of two things, and I think this is really important. One is a presumption that the private sector, by collaborating or by working together, can somehow fix this, because it can't. And hand in hand with that is delusional claims from within the private sector, including by financial institutions, about being able to reach net zero. So much more realistic to understand what you can do and what you can't do, what you can do yourself, what you can do in collaboration, and what currently you have no plan to achieve. And by making undescribed commitments, I think a better word actually is targets.
Targets is the language in Climate Action 100 Plus, exactly.
But there's a fundamental difference between a commitment and a target. A target is, we'd like to get there if we can, but if you scratch the surface on a target and you ask how realistic is the transition plan over which you have control and over which you have a meaningful plan between now and the target, most organizations won't have a good answer for you. So I think it's really important to avoid collective delusion on this as well.
So let me just, you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem isn't whether there's not enough collaboration. I think the collaboration is being oversold. And I think it's being oversold by GFANS a lot more than by Climate Action 100 Plus. So I think Richard's exactly right on that. I think in a way that kind of masks what sort of a deeper issue is. And here's where there's a big difference between the folks that I'm talking to and a lot of the folks in this room, is this deployment of capital. So there's deployment of capital and the non-deployment of capital. And, Republican friends would say there's going to be more coal, oil, and gas for longer than you'd like. And they don't think that divestment or withholding capital for new projects is an effective strategy. That's a big and important debate. And I think what you've got with GFANS now is sort of this notion that it's all about, even though the GFANS people tell me it's engagement, its mantra is, we're going to move capital away from the fossil fuel industry. And people say negative things about the fossil fuel industry, and they forget that it started as trees. I think it's a good reminder. So I think we need to have a candid conversation about that. There's also a myth, and Sophie, you repeated the myth, these $3 trillion in opportunities. There aren't $3 trillion in opportunities for the SDGs, for the private sector. There's probably not $1 trillion. You'd have to work really hard to find 500 billion. I talk to investors. It's like, okay, infrastructure. There aren't the bankable infrastructure projects in developing countries that need that much capital. So this whole myth of this great opportunity of $3 trillion pouring in from the private sector is just absolutely nutso. And I think, again, Richard, what he's saying is right, is that you can't over-expect what the private sector can do. And there's been this narrative, government is failing, private sector is going to step it up, financial institutions, companies, and that's just not realistic. And we have to accept that. Or legitimate.
Because the legitimacy of government, this is why, the return of big government, that was the Financial Times big read. But it's not big government. You know, this has got to be governance, however that government gets there, democracy or otherwise. We've got to accept that the private sector, finance, we say financial services. Let's put finance in service as the servant. If we got to the point where the private sector was in charge, we would have lost the legitimacy of government representing its people in different countries. That's why the Sustainable Development Goals are so important. Number one, the consultation, the legitimacy that they have because of how they got there, as much as what they say. So we need to be servants to our own fiduciary duty, but within that legitimate framework.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point. I'm going to put out to questions in a second, but I think it's an important point to say that I do think over the next 12 months or a couple of years, there needs to be a bit more conversation, a bit more honest conversation around the fact that this isn't all about upside, upside, upside and winners, and we're going to keep on making all the same money we made before, and we're going to do it within planetary boundaries and all the rest. I think there's been a real resistance to have that conversation in the mainstream space. I do hope that there'll be more options to have it. And please do come to the Exxon session, by the way. Anyone who's here tomorrow, it's going to be really interesting, and it's going to, Rob's moderating it, but it's going to be a look at whether this stuff around collaborative stewardship actually works. But we're going to run a bit over because we started a bit late, and I think we've got a bit of time afterwards. But I want to see if people have questions towards the back, because people at the backs of halls never get to ask questions. But there are roving mics, and I would be happy to take questions. There's one over here. We got roving mics? Yeah. Oh, now everyone's being shy. Mike has one. And we'll start with those. We'll ask them both if we can, and then go for it. Can you introduce yourself as well before you start?
I'm Jenny Ramos from the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative. I have a question for Richard. So Nathan referred to the question about whether the target really is a sustainable economy, a fully sustainable economy. So why is the ISSB not embracing double materiality as the EU and the TNFD have done, please?
Okay, and this is part of a bigger question around whether we can achieve all of these outcomes through risk, or whether we need to talk more about outcomes and impacts, right? And some of the other things. So it's a great question, but Mike, can we have a nice brief one from you,
sure.
please?
Am I on? Thank you. So firstly, I'd like to thank the panel for improving my theory of change, which says tipping points are coming everywhere and we need to accelerate them, and economics needs a tipping point. So my question is, how do we accelerate the acceleration of systemic risk and uncertainty into economics? Because we know that economics has befuddled us with the NGFS and CBES scenarios. Most people in the room know the scenarios are not decision useful because economists just love price. And price doesn't work when there's lurking systemic risk. So how do we accelerate a tipping point in economics?
Okay, very different kind of question. We're going to start with those two. Richard, I mean, the obvious person to start with is you.
Yeah, let me try to answer this one briefly. Materiality is a word which is vastly overused and generally very poorly understood and so on. So I think at heart it's a very simple concept. Information is material if it is useful to a given set of users. So in IFRS financial accounting, financial reporting, information is material if investors find it useful in making investment decisions. It's as simple as that. The notion of double materiality is that investors are not the only audience for information that companies produce. And so other stakeholders, society if you like, future generations, however you want to describe it, other stakeholders also have a legitimate interest in information produced by companies. So that's double materiality. Critically, if corporate impact on society and the environment is something which affects the entity's business model and its ability to make money, information about corporate impact is material to investors. So that's partly where the confusion tends to arise. So in our climate standard, we require scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, all 15 categories of greenhouse gas protocol emissions, financed emissions if you're a bank. Those are impact metrics, right? Those are global warming metrics. They're not financial performance metrics. but they are material to investors because this is a societal issue which affects a business's capacity to make money. The simple answer to why we don't do double materiality is because our focus is investors. That's our remit. That's our role within the system, is to complement financial accounting in a system of financial reporting to provide useful information to investors. GRI is the global standard setter for impact reporting. We have a memorandum of understanding with GRI in recognition that actually you need both. Mm-hmm. So just to illustrate briefly, we would say if you have a target for net zero, whatever it happens to be, tell your investors about the target. In other words, tell your investors how you're running your business. And if the target is consistent with a 2.5 degree transition pathway, so be it, right? If you're a policymaker or if you're a society concerned about corporate action, you want to know how are you going to get to 1.5, increasingly hard to do, by the way, right? But how are you going to have a transition pathway that's consistent with 1.5? Ideally, you want both sets of information. Yeah. You want to know what is the corporate sector actually planning to do and what are investors actually investing in, and in contrast, what do we need them to do to avoid collective disaster? So actually, double materiality is important, very important, but our role is financial materiality.
Can I jump in with one quick thing? Markets need two things. One, information, and that's the government job. We have a role to play supporting regulators in that. Number one, information. Two, incentives. And Bob, I think that's exactly to your point. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is pushing something close to $500 billion in incentives towards the green transition. Into red states, blue states, purple states.
80% into red states.
Well, my friend, that's the manufacturing Rust Belt.
Absolutely.
Which led to the disaffection. And, so we also mustn't lose sight of the just transition as a critical piece.
Nancy.
Look at what's happening in Europe, look what's happening in China with the Green Finance Plan. So information, number one, and Richard, you put it beautifully on the materiality issue, and I can completely attest to the model that you're explaining as being effective for investors. But the incentives are the other critical piece. So that's not just the tax credits and the subsidies. We've also got to pay attention to that important wording that came out of Glasgow, which was around the subsidies going to the ways of fossil fuel. But we have to do that roll-off of those subsidies in a way that doesn't cut people off from affordable access to the current energy supply. So, the everything, everywhere, all at once, yet again. So, but those are the two ways that we're thinking about this. And I would say also it's not a tipping point. That's like when something falls over because of gravity. We're at an inflection point. That's where we choose which way this falls. That's our agency, that's our power. So Martin Luther King, Dr. King Jr., the arc of history is long, it bends toward justice, only because we choose that. So let's keep that sense of agency.
I think the questions are related. It's an interesting question, Mike, that you asked, because it's basically a unit of analysis question. Right now we talk about materiality, where the unit of analysis is basically the company, right, is material to the company. You're talking system level. This is the work that Ellen is doing in the shareholder commons, and it gets into questions of fiduciary duty. There's a group called the Investment Integration Project. So, the shareholder commons people would say if you're a universal owner and you're dealing with this at the system level, you don't want to be supporting a company that's generating terrific alpha, if it's basically producing enough negative externalities that it's making the world a worse place. And then the question becomes, and this is where Rick has got to, when he published that thing on the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, because I talked to Sarah Murray about that at the Greenfin conference. She met some Republicans. I think we need to, she met both of them. It wasn't hard, there was only two. I think we need to resolve this question at the investor level around, does fiduciary duty, and I'd love your views on this, both as an asset owner and asset manager, allow trustees to take account of the system level or not, or does their fiduciary duty basically, limited down to the kind of portfolio level of individual companies?
No, and yes. So the no bit is you have to, as a fiduciary, you have to pay attention to everything that allows you to exercise three duties. Fiduciary is great on the Scrabble board, but it's a bit... What does it mean? It goes back to the Crusades, when the Knights Templar were off to fight their religious wars. They left their property behind, their land, their animals, and their wives. and the duties of the person taking over, the trustee, were prudence, like don't let anything fall to pieces while I'm away. Loyalty, you only do things in my best interest because this is my staff, or my pension fund, you might say, my pension savings. And thirdly, care, pay attention. That's why information matters so much. Now, you can't just look at that. If there is a flood coming to your farm, you need to do something, even though it's not what's going on my farm with my animals, my land, my chattels, as the family would have been thought with the servants. What's going on here? Things outside your farm are coming your way. So your exercise of prudence, your loyalty and care requires you to get those to higher ground. And there is case law, which Christine Shaw, who's here, my colleague, knows much better than I do. But in New York City going bankrupt back in the 1970s, there was an important case in the United States whereby the pension fund was asked, please buy our bonds because that's going to help us survive. Right? That's not anything to do with, is this an investment grade bond? You probably could have gone to somewhere else to get municipal bonds that were investment grade and not really high risk. But the argument that was tested in court is this was an exercise of fiduciary duty because the New York City pension funds were protecting the system upon which they relied. And that required that New York did not collapse into bankruptcy, but became continued and returned to solvency. And this is the home of Wall Street, so somewhat of interest for that reason too. But that, to me, is a really important bit to remember when we look at this. Is it system? As an investor, beta is your market return, and that is the bulk of what you offer to your clients. The alpha, we're active managers, Franklin Templeton, so we know all about the alpha, but your alpha and your beta cannot be, what can I say, cancelling each other out. You have to have a holistic approach.
Great, right. I saw people were shy when I first asked for questions, and now we're out of time, so I've seen a few hands up, but you're going to have to nab our panellists as they make their way out. I just want to ask very quickly in one sentence, and I'm going to start at this end, and I do want it to be very quick, but next 12 months, one kind of reflection or thing that we need to aim for from each of our panellists to see us off.
Okay, so I'll take less than a minute, but there's more than one. So we actually need ISSB, even when we know that goal alignment is the end point. So we must get this done on ISSB as quickly as possible. We've got to build the muscle for a financial system that can cope with this kind of reporting, and then we need to link it to sustainability goals. So that's number one. The second thing is, I think, stewardship. We're going to discuss it a lot at this session. What does goal-aligned system stewardship look like? Once we can answer that question, we know how to drive that big engine, and that'll have much more impact.
Great. Yulanda?
Yeah, I think our near-term focus is to look at real-world impact as a bank, what we can do, rather than focusing or becoming very fixated on the net zero goals and worrying about your own portfolio and then shuffling the assets around the system without making real change.
Yeah, good answer. Richard?
Well, Nathan's done the sales pitch for ISSB, so I don't need to do that. So within that context, I would say dramatic progress on credible transition plans.
Fab. Lovely and concise and very important. Bob?
Make friends with Republicans, or whatever the equivalent is in the country that you come from.
Now, we laugh at it, but it's very, very true, and it has to happen everywhere, not just in the US. Anne?
Tack into the headwinds. Use them. Don't sit in a corner sobbing, saying it's all too much. Nil desperandum.
So we don't have the luxury of despair. Despair's a pretty good jetpack sometimes, I think, but nonetheless, it's a positive note to end on. All that's left really is to say a huge thank you to our panellists for a really good springboard into the discussion.
So